Do you remember the first time you found a warp zone as a kid? Didn't that feel amazing? Like you stumbled upon something that was never supposed to be found. Like you were cheating. But it wasn't cheating. It was something worse. It was the game asking you not to play it. Hidden pipes, secret doors. You find one and suddenly you're skipping half the game. But the reality is, warp zones were created to be found. Their existence wasn't an accident, and they were also not meant to be top secret. They were intentional. So that raises a question. Why would developers create a game and then let you skip most of it? We tend to think of warp zones as rewards. You explore, you experiment, you do something unusual, and the game says, all right, you earn this. It feels like a bonus, but is it really? Because warp zones, in reality, don't give you more. They remove parts of the game that are already there. And if the levels, the content, are the point, why is the game helping you avoid them? And it's not just one game, and not necessarily even tied to the concept or idea of a warp zone. For example, in Super Mario Bros., you can skip massive chunks of the game within minutes using a warp zone. But in other early games, like The Legend of Zelda, you can reach late game areas early if you want. And then take the Metroid series, for example. Experienced players can skip entire areas completely using advanced techniques. So these are different games, but the same outcome. And keep in mind, none of these are glitches. They're part of the game design. The fastest way to play is not to play most of it. Look at when this mechanic was at its peak. In the 1980s, right into the early 90s. This is when games were very limited. Cartridge storage was so small, it feels absurd by today's standards. The original Super Mario Bros. Fits in about 40 kilobytes of data. So every enemy, every sound, every level had a storage cost, which makes the decision to include a warp zone even more strange. Because instead of protecting their content, developers kept giving you ways to skip it. The first warp zone in Super Mario Bros. Shows up in World 1-2. That's just minutes into the game, right at the start. Really, that's not a reward for mastering the game. That's making skipping large parts of it a priority. Crystal Castles in the arcade, Battletoads for the NES, Kid Chameleon for the Sega Genesis. These are all popular games known for their warp zones. You can probably think of many more. So this spans different platforms, different genres, but the same mechanic. Players are constantly being handed a way to jump forward. Now the question is, why? Is it simply the developers being generous? No, it's because they were trying to trick you. Those early games had two problems. The first problem was a repetition one. For most games at the time, there was no save system, so every time you died, you started over, which means players were repeating the same levels, the same sections, over and over and over. Now that creates an issue, because the more you repeat something, the more boring it tends to become. So developers needed a release valve, and warp zones solved that problem. They let players skip what they'd already seen, not as a reward, but more like a relief. But repetition wasn't the only problem. The second problem, as we mentioned, was scale. Cartridges were tiny. Often there wasn't room to build a very long game, but it still needed to feel like one in order to add value. Now, this is where developers got tricky using that same warp zone solution. Because if players don't see everything in one playthrough, the game feels larger than it actually is. So warp zones help split the experience. Different players see different parts of the game depending on which route they take. One playthrough can feel completely different from another, depending on the warps you use. So, with this one system, developers solved two constraints. They reduced repetition, and they preserved scale. And for a while, that worked. But both of those solutions depend on one assumption: that players wouldn't abuse the mechanic. As it turns out, they would. Initially, warp zones felt like secrets. You found one, and it felt like you weren't supposed to, like you'd just stumbled across an Easter egg that no one else had ever seen or heard of. But that feeling didn't last, because the moment players understood warp zones, they stopped being secrets. They became strategy. And that changed everything, because players don't just skip repetition, they skip anything they can. Entire levels became optional, not because they were bad, well, I guess sometimes they were, but mostly because they were inefficient. For most players, eventually a game stops being something you explore and becomes something you just want to finish. One recent game developer put it this way. He said, given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of a game. And the use of warp zones is a good example of that. At some point, you stop asking what's next and you start asking, what can I skip? So, although the warp zone idea initially set out to solve the problem of repetition and scale, in the process, it created an entirely new one, at least for developers. They trained players to see the game as something to optimize. And once that mindset takes hold, you're not really playing the game anymore. You're reducing it for maximum efficiency. And that mindset would have a huge effect on game design moving forward. Once players learn they can skip parts of a game, they start looking for skips everywhere. Not just the ones the developers planned. Now it's, what can I break? What glitches can be found? What's the fastest route? Warp zones didn't just change player behavior, they changed player values. Efficiency replaced curiosity. Speed replaced exploration. This is really where optimization culture begins. Speedrunning, finding game exploits, and the most efficient strats, as the cool kids say. They all have their roots in the idea of the warp zone. Now, developers eventually realized that the warp zone created a problem that they didn't intend. They didn't just give players freedom, they gave them a reason to ignore huge chunks of the game that the developer had worked hard on. So design had to push back. That's why in most modern games, skipping ahead is not part of the design. You need upgrades, keys, abilities to access the next part of a game. Now, legitimate non-exploit shortcuts still exist, but now they're controlled. They're gated. They have to be earned. Because letting players skip the experience is just not sustainable. Warp zones didn't just shrink a game, they taught players how to shrink every game. So, in the end, warp zones weren't just about skipping levels. They signaled the first time developers had to admit something, that they couldn't control how players would experience their games. Because once you give players a way to skip, they don't just use it when they need it. They use it whenever they can. And from that point on, the experience isn't defined by the game anymore. It's defined by the player. Warp zones didn't just change how games were built. They exposed something that was already true. That players aren't really trying to see everything. They're just trying to see it through to the end. And once a game allows that, it doesn't get smaller. You just stop needing most of it. At some point, seeing the end becomes more important than how you got there. So let me ask you, when playing a new game, do you like to take your time and explore, or do you prefer just to optimize your way through it? Let me know in the comments below. And if you made it this far, as always, thank you so much for watching. And until next time, happy gaming, my friends.